Welcome to Talking Thursdays. This is episode 58, and I'm joined today by Liam Creed. Liam is a creative director based out of Warsaw. Liam's work spans from brand strategy, creative direction, image making, and I had the pleasure of collaborating with him earlier this year on a project that launches hopefully over the next couple of months. But today we're going to hear a little bit about Liam's story, his work to date, and hopefully follow up with a really great conversation at the end. So Liam, over to you.
All right, great. First off, I just want to say thanks to James and team for inviting me to do this. As I was starting, my own career in design, listening to talks like this were hugely instrumental in me finding out who I am as a designer. So it feels like a privilege to be given the stage to share some of my work. To start, I thought it would be helpful to give an introduction to who I am and the work that I do for those unfamiliar. My name is Liam. I'm a creative director based in Warsaw. The work I do is quite multidisciplinary, but primarily it focuses on identities, campaigns, strategy, and image making. And the way that I work typically falls into three buckets. So it's either working directly with clients as Liam Creed Studio, working with collaborators and friends, or freelancing for studios around the world. I've been fortunate enough to work with a lot of different people, studios, and clients, many who I've respected for quite some time. And while the projects themselves can look quite different from one another, I think as a designer and as a studio, I'm less interested in defining a particular medium or visual output and more about a process and a way of thinking through creative problems. The common thread for me as a designer is really using design, strategy, and direction to sell ideas, whether those be big or small. And how this manifests across different projects really depends on the need and the context. So, some projects I'll be doing creative direction and brand identities. Other times it's doing styling, packaging, websites, social content. But really what I try to do and the way that I position myself within the industry is helping brands articulate their creative value through design or direction in all the different ways that can manifest. Sometimes that's helping to articulate brand credibility in a crowded market with a brand like Stockholm Lab, helping to visualize future thinking and what the possibilities could look like into the future with a brand like Arc'teryx, defining a new creative perspective for an established studio for Perfect Cartel, or helping customers engage with brand and product for somebody like Mies. And I think the through line through all of this is also questioning the frameworks we work within and we've built within our industry. And a project that really encompasses that is Social Medium, which is self-initiated strategy project where we kind of look at different ways that we can investigate and interrogate the practices that we work within in design and also in creative industries in general. So to give a little bit of context to how I got here, because my journey wasn't super linear, we can start with where I'm from and what are some early influences. So I was born and raised in Toronto, Canada, which is, for those unfamiliar, the home of Drake, is how it's colloquially known. But for those familiar, Canada sometimes can feel quite geographically isolated in terms of these, traditional centers for art, design, and culture. If we think of New York, London, or Paris, I think what makes Canada so special is you have these totally vast and totally different landscapes and cultures all within one country. And while that makes it so special and while that makes it so unique to the world, I think it sometimes breeds this sense of isolation, even though Canada is a home to this incredibly significant and progressive art and design scene. If I'm to think about, visually what Canada represents, I think it's quite diverse. For example, with Toronto, you have references of, Drake being this international figure, but then also the Hells Angels, which is this kind of another cultural figure in its own way. You have Chinatown, and you can walk 10 minutes down the road, and you have a Mies building. You have this incredible like Swiss design aesthetic, which is breeded into all of the governmental like iconography through, like the national park systems. But then you also have this really expressive and abstract indigenous um, art practice that is really like a soul within Canada. You have artists like Leonard Cohen and Drake and Neil Young, etc. And I think growing up here, it really made me interested in looking outward while also appreciating what's happening locally. And what I mean by that is the reason Canada is so, in Toronto specifically, is so diverse and interesting is because it pulls from so many different cultures and it's so accepting of so many different cultures. And I think my route into design and how that's manifested really came through art. So I studied fine art in school. I didn't study graphic design. That was something that I've come to um, realize later on and kind of build a career in. But painting was really the first place I developed an understanding of what making means. And I think for me, it was less about solving predefined problems, which often is what design is, but it's about inventing ways of looking and making. And I think that process that I've developed within painting and I learned about still informs how I approach design today. And looking back, I think hindsight's always 2020. I think the breadcrumbs for a career in design were quite obvious, looking at the influences I had. But in my studies, I was always interested in these multidisciplinary practices and pulling from music and film and fashion and how that could influence painting. And I think some of the influences, such as Bill Evans being about his improvisation and the restraint he had within his creative practice, but also equally being influenced by Kai Althoff and how maximalist he would approach abstractionism and how he would use ambiguity and perspective to build image. People like Jin Zhou was like a hugely instrumental person in terms of how I thought about um, the creative process and what it means to think about creativity. He's also, Montreal artist, so he felt a little bit close to home. But the way that he interacted with everyday culture and humor, and not treating creative work too precisely, but then almost in the same realm or almost on the opposite side of the same coin, you have Donald Judd, who really treated it as like a serious body of work and an endeavor that you like would spend a lifetime working on, and having this incredibly clear point of view and perspective on how he approached creativity in general. People like Peter Doig and his approach to image making and the importance of process. He would call himself like a studio painter, which means, having a practice of working within a studio to build imagery. When on the opposite side is somebody like Ed Ruscha, who's also a studio artist and would probably consider himself a practicing artist, where the visuals are very different, but the process of continually iterating, continually making work consistently is a through line between both of them. And in the later years of my studies, people like Yoko Nordstrom and Mama Anderson were, hugely influential. If you're unfamiliar, they're like these incredible, I believe, Swedish artists. We actually lived down the street from them in Stockholm when we lived there for a short little bit. But their, Yoko Nordstrom's like approach to creating images felt like nothing I've ever seen before. The effort, the acceptance of imperfection, the way that he would approach constructing a scene felt completely inventive but totally honest. And Mama Anderson just would build images in a way that like I've never seen before and felt incredibly influential. And as I was transitioning from a career in painting and these studies and trying to build a career in design, it was people like Martin Margiela and his approach to building a body of work as opposed to focusing on individual pieces, or Sister Creta Kent, which for me was like the real turning point where there was a crossover between art and design, where it was a super instrumental in those early stages of my career. But I think even now I try to look at quite eclectic set of references. So it's not only looking at design, sometimes it's finding influences within art, within fashion, people, conversations, architecture. And I think as a practicing artist or creative, I think having a really broad sense of references and a set of materials you can pull from really makes your work better and really is instrumental in how I approach my own creativity and my own practice. This is a quote from Jim Joe that I really love that's kind of stuck through everything that I do, but it's really about not having all the answers yourself. I think the most successful people, the most interesting people and successful designers I know are what I would consider interested people. And I think as like the biggest compliment you can receive as a person is somebody who's interested, being interested in other people, having your own passions, interested in different cultures and languages. And I think becoming genuinely interested in other people or becoming genuinely interested in different ways of thinking really is the rocket fuel to building a career within design or developing as an artist. So coming from an art background, I think one of the things that I found really funny as I started to work within design was the difference of what studio means. I think in art, studio is like a process of working. It's a way of thinking through things. It's almost the same way you would view like a laptop within design. It's like a tool you have. At the studio is like a tool, a place, and a process. But often in design, when I call myself Liam Creed Studio, there's an assumption that it means it's like a way to construct a business. There's a structure to it. There's multiple people that are sitting in an office working together. And I think there's a funny juxtaposition there. And I think this quote really references that contradiction for me. It's about, looking at how the differences between art and design ultimately, exist within the worlds they operate in. So art is about feeling and design is about this commercial world and it's about selling and buying. Um, I think when we think about design in the creative process of design as opposed to art, there's obviously client, there's an objective, there's budget, deadline, the audience that we're trying to communicate to. And I think painting or art in general doesn't necessarily have any of those things to the same degree. So if we think about the studio process, I mean, this is obviously a very intentionally simplified version of what creativity looks like, but the idea is that it can be quite messy. So you look at, history, you look at culture, the context of which you're making things. You have a practice which informs your ideas and a process which informs it as well. You get to the central idea and it leads to output, and that can be various or that can be single. And that output kind of feeds back into this process and practice and history and culture, really suggesting that all work is made within context of each other. But the design process gets a little bit more convoluted sometimes because you have market research and customer insights and shareholders and strategy and social metrics that feed into an idea very similarly, but that idea is explored through different mood boards. Once a mood board gets signed off, it leads into a concept. That concept eventually leads into an execution, and that becomes the output. And I don't think this is necessarily all of these things are necessarily bad, but they can sometimes squeeze experimentation out of the process. And there's a quote from Ed Rohe that I really love, which is the studio is a place where you can be wrong. And I think creativity in general, you need space to not immediately satisfy the brief or not immediately be right. Otherwise, you're just executing on what you already know works. But I think with everything moving quickly in these, conversations about AI and about efficiency within the creative process and, clients cutting budgets quite quickly, there's a constant pressure to produce and present and perform on like a very quick scale. And the period of where you can have these ideas that can grow and kind of manifest into this, interesting creative work often gets cut, and we don't really have that space to work. So for me, I think treating design as a studio practice is about protecting some space for those ideas to develop. And I think the way to do that is through owning the process and treating process almost as the intellectual property. So if we take the design process, this is what I've learned at different studios, but looking at my own practice, it's a constant work in progress, and you're trying to adapted and adjusted for the project or for the client, and trying to understand, different ways of working. But you always start with discovery, which is, research and immersion. That leads into strategy. From there, we go to the concept, design, and then progression. And I think if we think about these as different outputs, the majority of the work is reserving time for thinking. So it's reserving time to learn about the client, learn about their business, learn about the market, learn about different references, historic or contemporary, and then the design and the actual execution, which is often what the client conflates to the actual to the smallest part, or in my opinion, it should be one of the smallest parts. And I can break down what I mean further, where you have this inventive process, which is about finding references, kind of, getting these eureka moments. Then you have the reactive process, which is about reacting to that and then creating work in turn. So discovery really, again, is about being interested in other people, being interested in subjects and contexts and worlds. And strategy sometimes feels like this calculated chess move of tying everything to a larger brand narrative or, consumer insights. But I think it's really about defining why we're doing something and how we're going to approach it. From there, we get into concept, which is about building the creative idea in the visual world. And really, this is about finding the central idea and how do we construct images and worlds around it. And then design is really just about articulating that idea across everything and being consistent in how you do that. And I think that a part of the process that often doesn't get touched on quite enough is progression. So it's not just about delivering and moving on to the next thing, but it's about building relationships and allowing ideas to evolve, and being there to support clients through those hurdles that they're naturally going to face. And then also sustainability, which is about finding a way to give back. Ideally, you can do things that are sustainable for the earth and for the environment, but I think it's also about sustainability for the larger discipline of design or creativity. I think as I was starting off in design and not studying design and having somebody teach me what grid system was, or teaching me about different studios, I think hoarding references and hoarding processes and ways of working is a really unproductive way of working, in my opinion. And the reality is, as designers, what we do is reference. And I think stealing comes at a cost. And I think that cost should be opening the door and sharing those ideas to young people that are interested as well. Often the reason why we don't do that is we feel this sense of imposter syndrome where your references and your way of looking is kind of the intellectual property. But I think the discipline of design is all the more better when you share it and you make it open source to everybody else and you can find a way to give back. So how to make good work? If we take all of that, how do you actually make work that resonates with people and stands the test of time? I think as I think about my own career and the different studios that I've worked at, so much of it can be contributed to learning from others. So I thought maybe I could pull some ideas that were important to my own practice, not as necessarily rules, but as jumping off points and things that I'm still working on myself. And the first one is developing a point of view. So taste is useful, and taste often gets talked about a lot of being one of the most important things as you're working within design is having a taste and having perspective. But I think point of view brings you further. It's really about knowing why you like something, why you're drawn to it, and what you believe makes good work. I think it's a process of constantly trying to build these visual worlds, build references, build insights and connections. And over time, it'll start to accumulate into a recognized way of thinking. A project that's been super instrumental in that for myself has been social media. I work on it with a friend, Tom, and it was a way for us to investigate the things that we're interested in and the industry that we work in. And slowly over time, I've started to recognize, the images that I pull to tell these stories have this through line, and it's started to build a very collected body of work, even though it's, the subjects change and they're different. So I think, developing a point of view is one of the most important things you can do as a creative in general. The next one is find good collaborators to work with, and working with interesting people. In my opinion, you should always surround yourself with people that you think are better than you, so you can, rise to the occasion, but it also makes your work better. And I don't mean that in a sense of stealing, but it's an opportunity to learn from them, learn from the way that they approach problems, um, and try to work with people that bring the best out of you or bring something that you don't have. An example of this would be like my friend Colin, like the process that he uses to approach design to me is just like mind blowing in terms of it being so liberal and so free and so inventive and fun. And there's a quote that I love from On Studio is like the hallmark of any great collaboration is a shared belief in process and approach. And I think that applies to collaborators in studios, but it also applies to clients that you work with. I think so often as you're building a career as like a freelancer or like a young in a studio, you take projects just for budget, but often they don't buy into your way of thinking or your approach to work. And it's a process that I work through a lot too, of having a way that I want to work and having an expectation from the client to do things. So I think the best work and the work that always resonates is when you work with people that value you and your way of thinking and you respect their approach and their ideas as well. I think it's really important to design yourself constraints. I think unlimited possibility isn't always helpful. And if our brief doesn't give you constraints, sometimes it's best to invent them. For example, Morehouse is a brand that I've worked with for a few years now, and I help them with their image direction and strategy and how to shoot lookbooks. And I think one brief that we've set ourselves is how do we shoot? What are all the possible ways that we can shoot within a studio setting? How can we treat it inventive as opposed to every time reinventing the wheel? So whether it be one typeface or one photographer or one material, establishing a set of constraints that you can work from and you can push off against often create more interesting work. And then this process of refinement, I really learned this when I was working at Stockholm Design Lab, but refinement isn't just about making something prettier, it's about making an idea clearer. Stockholm Design Lab have this really beautiful idea of simple, remarkable ideas being the core of what drives their creative process. And I think great ideas are rarely right the first time. They emerge through the process of constant refinement, and it's about eliminating all the excess to find something that's thoughtful, useful, and is right to the project itself. And then design is always in context. So nothing we make exists in isolation. And I think the best brands and people um, know that. The reality is people and consumers experience brands or products alongside fashion, politics, technology, and everything else we deal with in a day to day. So the best work understands that moment and contributes to it in an emotional and effective way. I worked on the Rosewood rebrand with Comedian Studio a few years ago, and I think they were like a really great example of understanding where the luxury hospitality market was going and finding a way to articulate their creative perspective, operating almost as like an editorial platform as opposed to this luxury getaway. And I think some of the work that they do currently is some of the best within the industry for sure. And then the last one I would say is art is good for business. I think art and business can sometimes look like opposing forces, but actually, I think art offers something really unique to business and to design that is really valuable, and maybe that design can't really offer to the same degree. I think when the brands that I'm the most interested in, or the images that I'm the most interested in, or the products, whatever it may be, offer a sense of like emotion and ambiguity and surprise that tying everything to metrics and tying everything to consumer insights and what you think will perform really lacks. I think looking at brands like Husbands Paris or Phoebe Philo or Stockholm Design Lab or Homer Radio, for example, like it's all about emotion. It's all about inventing a feeling. And I think that is the core of how to make really great work. And I think if we think about what the best work that exists within like a cultural setting, it's sometimes it exists between art and design. And I think some clients, some designers try to separate them as two opposing forces when it's not always the case. Um, but yeah, hopefully that was left you with some interesting nuggets or things we can touch on. But yeah, again, thank you for the time and for the platform to share.
Thanks for the great talk. So many questions that I have to ask you, but I'm going to kind of jump straight in. How do you find ways within your own practice to give back or open those kind of metaphorical IP doors?
I mean, I think it's really comes to fruition in two different ways. I think one is treating the creative process as a little bit of an open door. I think this is something that I've started to realize through, working with different people, but showing the process is equally as important as showing the outcome. I'm quite liberal with the references and influences that I have. I often, drop a bunch of, when I'm working with a studio, like a bunch of references that I have that could be interesting. So I think that's one way to do it. But the other opportunity is really to give a platform for other people to work with. So I've brought in interns that have maybe had no experience within creativity or within styling or whatever project I'm working on, but treating that as an opportunity to allow them a space to work and build some experience. Because I think the hardest thing is to get that foot in the door and to speak the same language. So allowing people the opportunity to make mistakes and feel potentially uncomfortable. I think, I try not to judge and try to keep it quite loose and open.
Do you, from your perspective, why do you feel as though when studios are creating kind of like finalized case studies, that often the presentation of that is limited to the final output rather than really demonstrating that fuller process, which, as you say, is some of the most valuable parts of that work? Why do you think we're still at this point where agencies prioritize that versus that kind of that transparency of the way and the how behind how they got there?
I think because the design process is so often tied to, like I mentioned, like metrics,
Mhm.
like you're being brought into design packaging for this client. So the thing that's worth showing is the end result. And I think that comes along with a certain degree of imposter syndrome, thinking that the process isn't as valuable as the outcome because it doesn't in turn create a profit. But I think the most interesting work really is like how people approach process. Um, and I think often some of the advice that I got when I was building my own portfolio as like a junior trying to get jobs, I was lucky to like have a senior designer that like I really respected their work, and they told me that using these case study templates and mock-ups and stuff, it really just makes it look cheap. Like what people buy into is thinking and confidence in how present your ideas, whether that be just a logo without it being blind embossed on it, like just the static SVG of it, or behind the scenes photos. It just shows confidence in your
Mhm.
idea and your ability to execute. And I think sometimes studios really struggle with that because you have people with big budgets and so many competing people, different studios and creatives that are operating for the same brief basically.
Mm. You speak about the importance of defining a very clear point of view. But how do you find that your point of view manifests itself through both your art practice and also now your studio and creative practice? Like,
It's funny looking. I showed a couple examples of the paintings that I've done. It's very messy and they're very focusing on abstractionism. And I think as I started working with the design and developing like a sensibility for the type of design that I like, it was so much about minimalism and subtraction and what is like the most you can do with the little.
mhm.
And for a long time, I questioned like why it was so different. Like why wasn't I this maximalist like German designer that like did all this like amazing um like typographic work? Maybe it comes from growing up in Canada where you have this minimalism kind of imbued within everything. But I think what I've always been interested in, even within painting, was what is the simplest way to explain an idea. Sometimes in painting, that was about layering things over top of each other as opposed to building it into a scene. If you look at somebody like Yoko Nordstrom, it was like using perspective almost like irrelevant. It was like you can do a car
Hmm.
here and a face here and this here, and you construct an image that way, and that tells a narrative. And I think with design, it's if you want to express luxury, you want to express credibility, what is the most simple way you can do that? Maybe it's just doing the logo. You don't need to do flourishings around it. And I think another part of the process is just being really direct with references and being really direct with um, where you pull from. In painting, I would often, like listen to music or be watching like a film by Truffaut and would just paint something that was relevant to that moment. And I think design, what I tried to do is infuse that in. So, if I'm in the moment, for example, interested in like French New Wave cinema, maybe the references for how we approach photography come from that, or the mood board is maybe not even relevant to the industry, but it's relevant to the feeling that I have at the time, and treating references directed immediate as opposed to steeped within strategy and history. So I think the manifestation is different, but the process of how I approach, I think, is really rooted in the same
Mm.
ideology.
I do wonder because obviously you collaborate in a multitude of different ways, working kind of direct to client. You run your own self-initiated kind of works, but you also collaborate with studios. So as you've developed this point of view, how do you manage that when stepping into a studio that already has an established way of thinking? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is maybe a little bit of an unpopular point of view, but I think we're so lucky to be given the privilege to work as designers, and
mhm,
often it gets conflated to being very serious and very stressful. To me, like it's just a privilege that I can do this work. The way that it manifests isn't so important to me sometimes. Sometimes you take a project because you want to, work with that client and understand how a studio works in the client relationship. Other times you want to learn from their process and you pick things from that. I've worked
mhm,
definitely at studios that I think I don't want to say disagreed because that suggests that, there's like a hierarchy, but it didn't resonate with the way that I like to approach problems or I like to approach creativity. But that's also gives you a barometer of what you like and what you don't like. So sometimes it's, I mean, maybe unpopular, but it's okay just to get a paycheck and then you don't really love the work, but you're still getting paid and you're still enjoying it. But you can start to map, in your own mind, like what studios you like and what studios you don't
mm.
like.
But what from your experience, what makes a great or an incredible studio? What do you believe are those tenets that make up a really great studio? And
I think the leaders that I've really respected and the studios that I've really respected really stand behind their work.
mhm,
So when they're presenting, they feel confident and they give the designers that work under them the platform to create work. I think when a studio and the culture starts to fail, it's when they really start second guessing their own process and their own execution. I mean, Stockholm Design Lab, like looking back at my time there, I was only interning, but it was just the confidence that they had within their own execution and their own ideas and process made it feel really liberating working there because you knew that
mhm,
you felt supported. You knew that what you were doing was in a framework that worked. Every time I've worked at a place that I didn't like, it was when they were constantly guessing the designers, guessing what the client wanted, guessing the process, and you'd present something and they would give up on the idea on the spot just to appease the client.
mhm,
Sometimes you have to do that, but I've always resonated with people that really back the designers and give them a place to create work that they like and create work that resonates and feel supported and don't feel like they're a problem and going to lose their job every 2 weeks.
but, yeah, it's just such a privilege to hear you speak. Your intellect shines through. The thoughtfulness that just seems to kind of exude through everything that you say. I had a hugely positive experience collaborating with you earlier in the year, and everything that you've said today is fully validated through the experience that I shared, seeing the work that you produced, and it was not just fantastic work, but it was also, as I said, it was a pleasure being able to collaborate with you and your expansive minds.
Yeah, thank you very much. The feeling's mutual. Appreciate it.